Let's talk about something that is new and also old. And this concept of autoregulation is probably one of the most um, popular ways to train in barbell sports in the last decade. But it really stretches back farther than that. If you look at the original 3 sets of 10, if you ever wonder where that came from, the old DeLorme and Watkins study, medical doctors from World War II who saw all these soldiers coming back from World War II with injuries and started doing resistance training as a way, hey, could this actually promote better recovery? And it turns out, not surprisingly, those of us know about the barbell, it did. And they originally started with 10 by 10 training. So, those of you like German volume training, that is not originated by the Germans. But quickly found that 3 by 10 was just as effective, and you didn't have to overdose, essentially, of over volume individuals early on. They started with progressive resistance exercise, but then moved to adjustable progressive resistance exercise. So essentially, the sets would build, and upon the last set in the cycle, 3 sets could be the hinge set to determine what happens next. So if 10 sets was the goal, and the expectation was that a certain load you would hit 10 repetitions, but if you hit more repetitions than you were supposed to, the next set you would actually go up in weight. If you hit the number of repetitions on the nose, you would continue with that weight one more set, and if you didn't hit that repetition number with the load that was prescribed, you would lower the load. And this is still used today in rehabilitation, this concept, and we use it more and more now in strength conditioning. For a long time in strength conditioning, it was about percentages. So I was the same ilk of 80%, 90%, whatever, and then you run through this program. And the difficulty was in larger strength conditioning settings was how do you auto-regulate a group of 40 athletes when you're the only coach? That's pretty hard to do. And I would agree it is, having coached in situations where far worse ratios, hundreds of athletes potentially with only 1 or 2 coaches. And so, at a time on the floor even. And so how do you even do this? Well, what's kind of been born out of the last few years is this rediscovery of autoregulation in a different format, even though it's nothing really new. Again, DeLorme Watkins, you're trending back to the 40s, right? I mean, obviously after the war and into the 50s, when a lot of this information, the resistance training really took off as a viable way of rehabilitation. And then, of course, bodybuilding culture and weightlifting. You have the titans of the day, York Barbell, and of course Joe Weider. If you ever want to read a good book, Muscletown USA, I recommend it. It's a good read about some of the history and the physical culture in the United States in particular, and kind of how it's affected the world. But anyway, sidebar. Autoregulation, though, this idea has been reborn and set in reps and reserve, and the use of RPE, and we have all these other types of scales that can help us determine what is an accurate load, instead of forcing the load on somebody, but an accurate load for the individual within the day. And with even from set to set or from week to week in a cycle, the expectation maybe the athlete should be hitting by 85%. And I say athlete, but anybody be hitting 85% of their max for X amount of reps. And based on their max, this is the training load they should use. But in reality, they're too tired to use that load, or man, they're really on fire this week. Let them run with it. And so again, there's different ways to do this. And I want to first highlight that autoregulation in the research literature, not surprisingly, has shown better results in terms of strength output in particular than that of a strict program. And that makes sense. You can have a beautifully written, I've done this, I won't say they're beautiful, but I've written some programs I thought were really well done, and the athlete started in them and they got crushed, right? That's usually what happens, is the athlete gets crushed. You think, oh, I've regulated this well. When research literature show this as well, like what the coach thinks should happen and what actually happens are two different things. And we tend to regress to the mean. So you think on a hard day, the athlete pulls it down, and on a day that should be lighter, the athlete pushes it up, and now recovery isn't as good as it should be. And then the days when you should be pushing aren't as good as they should be because the athlete's tired, so they get crushed. And so, you have this lack of progress because of the lack of extremes in the programming. Both heavy days and light days, and high volume days and lower volume days, etc. High low is a great way to program. And so that forced the athlete though into this cycle, and it doesn't work very well. Again, I thought I wrote some nice programs, come back, the athlete got crushed. So the autoregulation technique of letting the athlete choose the load is a fantastic way in order to help individuals, especially as a remote coach, but just in general, if you're training in a gym or you're training at home, these are great ways to help yourself in terms of fitting yourself to the program, is what I'm getting at. Okay, a lot of gibberish just to say that. How does it look? Well, you can do a couple things. RPE is rating perceived exertion, run 1 through 10 if you use it more in the resistance training type of scale rather than the aerobic type of training, endurance type of training. Sorry, my cheap coffee is coming back on me a little bit. And so, 1 through 10 corresponds to 10% all the way up to 100%. So you could prescribe in an exercise, or you could think about, I'm going to do an RPE of 8, which would be roughly 80%, and I'm going to do it for X amount of reps that I think I should do 80%. Okay, and the reps I think are very helpful in some aspects and some not, and I'll highlight that in a second. RPE is very useful in Olympic style weightlifting. So it's hard to use the other method, reps in reserve, like on a snatch. But if you said, hey, hit this snatch complex or do a snatch or clean and jerk or whatever it is, and I want you to hit an RPE of 7. And I find this really handy when doing power movements, because everybody, some people are better at power movements than they should be, and some, compared to their true or their full clean, let's say their power clean is better than than you would think it would be. It's usually around 80%. Well, it's actually, they're actually really good at power cleans, and there's somebody else is not so good at power cleans, and so you can't, using percentages is rough with power movements based on their full movements. And so again, I'm just using an example. This could be a way of saying I'm going to do an 8 in the power clean. Okay. That 8 could change from week to week. It could be the same exact exercise and the same exact repetitions, but it could change from week to week, and that depends on the athlete feels. And if you give them the green light, or if you give yourself the green light to go ahead and run with it in the days you feel great, and the days you don't feel good, obviously you take the load down. That's fantastic. You can also program minimums, so you could say, well, I want you to hit at least, or I want to hit at least 3 repetitions at 80% today, no matter what. And then after that, I'm going to auto-regulate the rest of the repetitions. Maybe I have 8 reps left that are chopped up into sets of 2 or whatever. And I'm going to let myself decide then how the load should change. So, in terms of volume, you could give a volume, 12 repetitions or whatever it may be. But I still think it's valuable to set and rep things. So to say 6 sets of 3 at a 7, all through these sets, for example. Do this clean and jerk complex, 3 rounds of it at a 7. Okay. And there's 3 movements per round, okay, of the complex. I think those are good ways to think about it. So that's RPE. RPE can also be used in when it comes to strength movement. My phone rang. Sorry, that's why it was disjointed. But I'm gonna try to make it smooth as possible. But you can use RPE in strength movements as well, because you can again sense the load. If you have 85% of the bar and it feels more like a 10 out of 10 that week, then that's not correct. And so you could say, well, I'm going to do an RP, we could turn around and say, well, you should be squatting with these sets and reps. You're doing 2 sets of 5 or whatever. And you should be at an RP of 5, or excuse me, RP of 8. And it feels like a 7, push the load up, right, for the next set. Or it feels like a 10, you'd lower the load down and so on. Okay, so RP can be useful, very useful in strength work. It could be used in volume work. So you can say, you do all these reps and feel like a 7. But when it comes to volume work, it's probably a little bit easier to use the reps in reserve method. And that reps in reserve method could also be used for strength. The reps in reserve look like this: is, hey, do this load. Again, you could use, some people don't use reps, but I like still, you have a rep range. You could do 10 to 12 repetitions for 3 sets, and it needs to be 2 to fail. So that means you would leave 2 in the tank. You would leave 2 repetitions from failure. Now, failure could be different depending on the exercise. And most, like a compound movement, might be technical failure, which is probably applied to most of exercise. But if it was like a band exercise, it might be until perception of failure, right? I mean, you can go forever and with a band, let's say do band bicep curls, and technique is probably going to be just fine. It's going to be a perceptual issue. Point is that you leave 2 in the tank. Or you could do 1 in the tank. That means you're gonna get closer to failure. You go to failure. You go to 5 from failure. That's going to be obviously a lighter load. So 5 from failure at 10 to 12 repetitions. You actually can do 15 to 17 repetitions, but you're going to stop at 10 to 12. That's a great way to do volume training. And then again, in strength work, also a good way. You could say, let's do that 85% set, but leave 2 in the tank. So you're like, well, 85% was pushing me to max this week. Well, then you need to take the load down and make sure you stay 2 away from fail. Failure can be beneficial, but if it's mismanaged, the fatigue that accrues as a result of failure can rapidly overwhelm the next week and the next week and the next session. And so now your volume starts to drop, or the load starts to drop because you're fatigued. You can pick up an injury, potentially. You can get overreached a lot easier. Fatigue is a good tool, but it has to be managed very, very carefully. There's a time to go to failure, and there's a time to not. If it's a novice back squatter, obviously never a time to go to failure. If you're doing bicep curls in a simple exercise, you might go to failure in the last set every week, depending on the exercise and who you are. Okay, I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying it depends. That's always a big factor, and I'll make a video on that as well. So, two to fail, or excuse me, reps in reserve for volume training, strength training is a great idea. When it comes to RPE, I think that's better applied to Olympic style weightlifting and strength work rather than volume work. And so those are the different ways to do, auto-regulation. I've seen, again, just 8x3, an 8. That's your RP for the day. Work on that. No loads. The loads don't matter. Now, there could be days that it's a max out day, and yeah, you could do a minimum. I want you to hit at least 90% of this X amount of reps, probably 1 or 2. And then from there, you can adjust the load down if you want to. If you're feeling great, now we have a max out day. Now, there's days to push even harder, right? Like, you got to hit this load today for some reason. That can happen. And so that's a percentage driven thing. All right, last note on this. Who's this for? It's easier in experienced lifters to use these type of things because you've experienced failure. However, when I do a lot of remote coaching, I do quite a bit of remote coaching, using reps in reserve and RP is just fine as well. It's just not as accurate initially. And that's okay, because if I'm not there to watch somebody do an exercise, I want to make sure that 2 to fail, I'd rather have them be actually 4 to fail, right, than go into failure. Or if their technique, I've never really coached them very much in their technique, I'd rather see them do things that are leaving a lot of repetitions in the tank initially and avoiding injury, and have room to build volume over time. And so in the advanced athlete has a great advantage, because the advanced athlete can modulate the loads as needed. They know their bodies, they know what max and hard training feels like, and they can gauge that feeling off of their submaximum work or whatever it is, or how they feel about pushing that day. That's where a coach sometimes is helpful to say, hey, you are fine today, push harder. Or, hey, you're pushing way too hard. So there's still the chance for error and loading, but it gives the individual some flexibility. And in the novice trainer, it keeps them out of trouble a lot of times, to be honest with you. So if you're just beginning, there's nothing wrong with using these things as well. Even if you're like, I have no idea what failure feels like. How in the world would I gauge what 2 to fail is? Well, you can start to get there as you start to train. There's some trial and error, but it gives you a place to start and keeps you out of trouble and staying away from that failure. So that's auto-regulation in a nutshell. There's other ways to use it. I used it in the barbell world. They use it in the endurance training world. It's a very effective way of training. I mentioned rehab because you fit the person to the program, and rather than forcing the program on the person. And I would highly recommend, speed training, everything else. I'd highly recommend you look at auto-regulation. Yeah, if you use percentages initially or set volume, that's fine. But over time, I think you'll find that you're going to need some way of modulating load. We've all kind of been smashed against the rocks one week, or another week we thought, man, we could have went a little bit harder. This gives you that flexibility to do so.